So, walking down the aisle, I spotted Camilla, pale grey-veiled pillbox hat. Saw it all. Diana said those words on tape, not in an interview, not on television, into a recorder in her apartment at Kensington Palace, alone, talking to a machine that she trusted more than she trusted most of the people around her. She was recounting the single most watched moment of the 20th century, the moment 750 million people had called a fairy tale, and the detail she remembered most vividly from the entire walk down that aisle was not the flowers, not the music, not the 25-foot train behind her, or the 5 bridesmaids trying to keep it straight, or the roar of the crowd outside. It was a hat, pale grey, veiled. Pillbox. She had looked for it. She said so herself. I knew she was there, of course, I looked for her. In the middle of the most watched moment of her life, with 750 million people watching her face, Diana Spencer was scanning the congregation of St. Paul's Cathedral for one woman, and she found her. And she saw it all. Camilla's son Tom standing on a chair beside his mother, the two of them close enough to the aisle that Diana could see the detail of the hat clearly as she passed. She described it as a vivid memory. She described her wedding day as the worst day of her life. Those two things, the fairy tale the world saw, and the vivid memory Diana carried, are the same moment, the same aisle, the same 20-year-old girl in the ivory silk dress with the perfume stain on the wrist she was trying to cover with her hand, the same woman who had seen the bracelet 2 weeks earlier and gone to her sister's and been told the tea towels were already printed and it was too late to change anything. She walked toward the altar. She had already spotted Camilla. She said her vows. She smiled for 750 million people. And the palace, which had orchestrated every detail of that morning down to the placement of the flowers and the timing of the carriages, had no idea what was walking down that aisle alongside the dress and the train and the Spencer tiara. A woman who already knew, who had already looked, who had found the hat in the pew, and seen it all and filed it in the part of her memory, she would eventually call vivid, and kept walking. This is that story. It comes from Diana's own voice on the Morton tapes, recorded in secret in 1991 and 1992, and released publicly after her death. From the accounts of Jenny Bond, the BBC correspondent who knew Diana personally and reported what Diana had told her privately. From biographers Tina Brown, Ingrid Seward, and Tom Bower, whose combined decades of research form the most complete picture of this marriage the public record holds. From Ken Wharf, Diana's protection officer, who was in the room for the confrontation that came 8 years after the cathedral. From Paul Burrell's sworn testimony at the 2008 inquest. Nothing here is invented. Before we go further, if this channel has ever given you a Diana that felt true, take 1 second and subscribe. This one started on a July morning in 1981 and it never really ended. Let's start before the aisle. Because to understand what Diana saw when she found that hat, you have to understand what she already knew when she walked through those doors. The engagement had been announced on February 24, 1981. Diana was 19. She had met Charles a handful of times. She was young and largely uncomplicated in the way that the family had specifically required. No past, no entanglements, no history that could become a tabloid story. She was, in the word the institution used, suitable. What she was not was informed. The bracelet came about 2 weeks before the wedding. A gold chain bracelet with a blue enamel disc, engraved with 2 letters, G and F. Gladys and Fred, the private nicknames Charles and Camilla used for each other. Diana found it on a desk in the office of a member of Charles's staff. She opened it. She knew immediately what she was looking at. She went to her sisters, Sarah and Jane. She told them she couldn't go through with it. Their answer is one of the most quoted lines in the entire Diana story because it captures with perfect precision the trap she was standing in. Bad luck, Dutch. Your face is on the tea towels. You're too late to chicken out. Her face was on the tea towels. And then, the night before the wedding, the last night she would spend as a private person, as Lady Diana Spencer, before the world changed permanently around her, Charles allegedly told her that he didn't love her, not in those words, but in the way that people who cannot bring themselves to say the true sentence say the true sentence anyway. It landed. She heard it. Diana described the morning of the wedding on the Morton tapes with a specific and devastating phrase. She said she felt a kind of detachment, like watching herself from above. The girl in the dress, walking toward the cathedral, was someone she was observing, rather than inhabiting. The mechanism the mind builds when it is protecting itself from something it cannot otherwise survive. She got into the glass coach. The crowds outside were extraordinary. She smiled. She was 20 years old, and she was performing the most public act of her life in a state of internal detachment, carrying the knowledge of a bracelet and a phone call and a night that had offered no comfort. And then the doors of St. Paul's Cathedral opened, 25 feet of train behind her, 5 bridesmaids managing it. The nave of St. Paul's stretching 3.5 minutes ahead of her. The walk from the west door to the altar took 3.5 minutes, which is a very long time to walk in silence towards something you are not certain you want to reach. The organ was playing. The congregation was enormous. Outside, the crowd's noise filtered through the stone walls as something felt rather than heard, the weight of 750 million people. And Diana was scanning the pews. She said it herself. I knew she was there, of course. I looked for her. Think about what that sentence contains. Not, I hoped she wasn't there. Not, I tried not to look. She knew. She looked. She found her. The pale grey hat. The veil. Tom standing on the chair. She saw it all and she kept walking. Jenny Bond, the BBC correspondent, who knew Diana personally and spoke with her privately across the years of the marriage, said later that Diana had told her she had felt like a lamb to the slaughter as she walked up that aisle. That she knew things weren't quite right. That when she saw Camilla in the congregation, she was immediately uneasy, walking toward her wedding. The cameras on her face, 750 million people reading her expression as joy. Here is what the world saw, a radiant young woman, slightly overwhelmed, smiling softly, moving with grace through the most beautiful cathedral in England toward the man who would make her a princess. Here is what was actually happening, a 20-year-old girl, detached from her own body, scanning a congregation for a woman in a grey pillbox hat, finding her, filing the image, and keeping her face perfectly still while she did it. She kept walking. She reached the altar. She said her vows. She got the words slightly wrong. She called him Philip Charles Arthur George instead of Charles Philip Arthur George, a small stumble that the cameras caught and the world found charming. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was marrying a man who had commissioned a bracelet for another woman 2 weeks earlier, who had told her the night before what she had feared was true, whose mistress was sitting in the 3rd row in a grey pillbox hat watching the whole thing, and she said the vows anyway, because the tea towels were already printed. The public version of the wedding was perfect. The photographs were perfect. The balcony kiss or the near kiss, the brush of lips that Charles offered when Diana tilted her face toward him, was photographed from every angle and printed in every newspaper in the world. In private, Diana spoke to no one about what she had seen and felt that day. Not immediately. The institutional machine swept her forward. The photographs, the reception, the honeymoon in 2 parts. First Broadlands, then the Britannia. She was a princess now. The performance had no intermission, but the vivid memory sat. The pale grey hat. Tom on the chair. Saw it all. 8 years later, in February 1989, Diana did something the palace had never calculated for. She turned up at Camilla's sister's birthday party uninvited and went down to the basement and said to Camilla's face the sentence that had been building since she walked down that aisle. I know what's going on between you and Charles. Don't treat me like an idiot. The room froze. The men fled upstairs. Ken Wharf, her protection officer, 3 feet away, watched her walk across that basement with steady hands and described it afterward with one word he kept returning to across decades of interviews: confident, terrified, and confident, both at the same time. The way you are when you have been carrying something for 8 years and you have finally decided to put it down. She told Camilla she was sorry she was in the way. She told her it must be hell for both of them. And then she said the 4 words that the confrontation had been building toward since a July morning in 1981. I want my husband. Camilla's reply, as documented on the Morton tapes in Diana's own voice, was to gesture at everything Diana had. The men who loved her. The children. The life. What more could she want? And the answer Diana gave was so simple and so devastating that the woman who heard it, standing in that basement, apparently didn't know what to say next. Wharf has described that sentence sitting with him for 30 years, a man trained to read rooms and assess situations and stay analytical in the most charged environments imaginable, and he has spent 3 decades not fully being able to explain what happened in that basement after those 4 words landed. Here is what this story has been building toward. Because the confrontation in the basement in 1989 is the event everyone talks about. The 4 words, the hat in the basement, the bodyguard who still can't explain Camilla's reply. But the cathedral moment in 1981 was something different and something older. It was the moment Diana made a choice. Not to stop the wedding. That option had been taken from her by the tea towels and the institution, and the weight of everything that had been set in motion. But to see clearly, to look for the hat, find the hat, see it all, and walk forward with that knowledge rather than away from it. She was 20 years old. She was walking into a marriage she had serious doubts about, toward a man who had already given his heart to someone else, in a building full of people who were watching her face for joy. And she chose to see, to know, to file the vivid memory rather than look away from it. That choosing to see, that refusal to be managed into not knowing what she already knew, is the thread that runs through everything that followed. Through the tapes she made for Morton, through the basement in 1989, through the Panorama interview in 1995, when she sat across from Martin Bashir and said 3 of us in this marriage in front of 23 million people. Through every moment she chose truth over management. It started in St. Paul's Cathedral, walking down an aisle in ivory silk, scanning the pews, finding the hat. She didn't look away. She never looked away, not once in the 16 years that followed. Leave her here. Not in the cathedral. Not at the altar. In the moment just before the doors opened, the glass coach has arrived. She can hear the crowd outside, not individual voices, just the weight of it. Thousands of people who have waited hours and some of them overnight to see this. Her train has been settled. Her veil is in place. Her bridesmaids are ready. She is 20 years old. She knows about the bracelet. She knows what she heard on the telephone. She knows what happened the night before. She has the knowledge that the institution has spent months trying to manage around. And she is carrying it alone, because there is nobody in this carriage who can help her put it down. The doors are about to open. She takes a breath. She has decided, in whatever way a 20-year-old girl can decide something with 750 million people watching, and her face already on the merchandise, that she is going to see clearly. She is going to look for the hat. She is going to see it all. She is going to walk the full 3.5 minutes with her face composed and her eyes open, and her back straight, not because she has been told to, not because the institution requires it, because if she is going to walk into this, she is going to walk into it knowing exactly what it is, with her eyes open, without the kindness of looking away. The doors opened, the crowd roared, the organ swelled. Diana Spencer walked into St. Paul's Cathedral, into the fairy tale that belonged to 750 million people, and to no one at all, and she found the pale grey hat in the pew, and she saw it all, and she kept walking, and nobody in that cathedral, not Charles, not the family, not the courtiers who had managed every detail of that morning, understood what was walking down that aisle beside her. A woman who already knew, who had chosen to know, who would spend the next 16 years making sure that what she knew did not stay buried in an institutional silence that called itself discretion, and was actually something much less dignified than that. She said it was a vivid memory. She never forgot it. Neither should we. The cathedral was not the end of the story. It was the first page of it. What followed across the next 16 years was a marriage that the world watched as a fairy tale, and Diana lived as something far more complicated and far more costly. The bracelet, the honeymoon cufflinks, the phone calls she overheard at Highgrove, the years of dinners where the arrangement everyone pretended not to see sat in the middle of the table like a guest nobody would acknowledge, the bulimia that the palace treated as a private embarrassment and Diana described on tape as her way of coping with the thing nobody would name out loud, the self-harm. The nights in the apartment at Kensington Palace when the boys were at school and the phone didn't ring the way it used to, and the structure that had managed every hour of her adult life had quietly withdrawn. She had walked into all of it with her eyes open. She had found the hat in the pew and seen it all, and filed the vivid memory, and in the years that followed she kept filing, kept seeing, kept refusing the management that the institution offered in place of the truth. The palace had a word for this, several words, unstable, difficult, emotional, the kind of language that turns a young woman's refusal to pretend into a personality defect, the kind of language that the people around Charles used when they needed to explain why the arrangement wasn't working. And the arrangement, in their telling, was always Diana's failure rather than anyone else's choice. She heard those words. She heard them applied to herself by people who had never sat across a table from the thing she was being asked to sit across from. People who had never walked 3.5 minutes down an aisle toward a man who had given his heart somewhere else, in a building full of people reading her face for joy, with the knowledge of a bracelet sitting in her chest like a stone. They called her unstable. She called it a vivid memory. By the time she sat down across from Martin Bashir in November 1995, she had been carrying that vivid memory for 14 years. She had told it on tape to Andrew Morton 3 years earlier. She had described the pale grey hat, Tom on the chair, saw it all. She had described walking down the aisle with the knowledge already in her that the marriage was not what the world was watching it be. And those tapes had become a book, and the book had detonated under the House of Windsor, and the Prime Minister had stood in the House of Commons and announced the separation, and the divorce had followed, and by November 1995 Diana was a free woman in every legal sense and in almost no other sense. The Panorama interview was not an ambush. Nothing Diana did was ever truly an ambush. That was one of the things the palace consistently failed to understand about her. She planned carefully, quietly, in the manner of someone who had been watching the institution manage information for 15 years and had learned every lesson it had to teach about how to move without being seen until the moment of your choosing. She called the Queen's private secretary 15 minutes before the broadcast. 15 minutes. Not to ask permission, to notify. The line between those two things was the line Diana had been drawing her whole adult life inside the institution, and by November 1995 she had stopped pretending it wasn't there. 23 million people watched. The sentence landed. There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. Camilla's name did not need to be spoken. The pale grey hat did not need to be described. Everyone knew who the 3 were. Everyone had always known. Diana was simply the first person inside the institution to say it on camera, in her own voice without euphemism. The palace froze in a way it had not frozen since the abdication. Not because the information was new, because it had been said. Because Diana had taken the vivid memory she had been carrying since the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral and placed it on the public record where it could never be managed back into silence. The Queen wrote to both Charles and Diana after the broadcast. Not asked. Told. The marriage should end. The divorce was finalized the following August. By the standards of the institution, it was a resolution. By the standard of what Diana had actually been through, it was closer to an acknowledgement, belated, institutional, impersonal, that what she had known since the aisle had been real all along. There is a detail from the Cathedral day that almost never gets mentioned alongside the vivid memory and the pale grey hat, a small thing. The kind of detail that matters more than the dramatic ones. As Diana walked through the west doors of St. Paul's, she spilled perfume on her wedding dress. She had been trying to dab some on her wrists in the final minutes before the procession. Her makeup artist, Barbara Daly, told her to hold that spot on the dress as she walked, to grip the fabric there, as though she were lifting the front of the skirt so she wouldn't step on it. A way of hiding the stain, of moving forward with the evidence of the last private moment concealed in the way she held the dress. She walked the entire aisle like that, holding the spot, covering the stain, smiling. That is the image that stays with you when you know it, not the cathedral in all its grandeur, not the train spreading behind her across the marble floor, not the 750 million people reading her face for the joy they needed to see. Just a 20-year-old girl holding a spot on her dress so nobody could see where something had spilled, moving forward, eyes open, finding the hat, seeing it all. This was who she was from the beginning, not the girl the institution thought it had selected, manageable, suitable, grateful, quiet, but someone who saw clearly and remembered precisely and chose, again and again across 16 years, to say what she saw rather than perform what was expected. She called it a vivid memory. The palace called it a problem. History has had time to decide which of those descriptions was right. The flowers outside the gates in September 1997 were the answer, left by people who had watched her walk down that aisle in 1981 and had understood, even then, even at a distance of 750 million people, that something about her face told the truth about what was happening. They left the flowers for the woman who had found the hat and seen it all, and kept walking. They understood, without being told, that the walking had cost her everything, and that the seeing had been the bravest thing of all. Thank you for staying with me through this one. The cathedral moment is the one that most people know the surface of, the fairy tale wedding, the dress, the balcony. What most people don't know is the 3.5 minutes it took to walk down that aisle and what Diana was doing with her eyes the whole time. She was looking for the hat. She found it. She kept walking. That is not the act of a fragile woman who didn't know what was happening to her. That is the act of someone who had already decided that whatever came next, she was going to face it with her eyes open. And she did. Every single time.